Welcome to this broadcast of the morning call. Starting us off, Sudan has denied claims from a report by Amnesty International alleging the use of chemical weapons on civilians in the troubled country. Now, however, the rights group has documented deaths and conditions as a result of the effects of dangerous chemicals. The attack backdates to when government forces in the country launched a campaign, a military campaign, in the Jebel Marra area in Darfur.
And just to remind you that it was in front of a jubilant crowd that Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir announced that peace had returned in Darfur on the 7th of September, just less than a month ago, when he said, "Darfur is better today than yesterday, and tomorrow it will be even better." 2 days later, Amnesty International reported that a chemical attack was carried out in the Jebel Marra region in the central part of Darfur, the 30th since January. In total, up to 250 people, many of them children, have died.
To weigh in on this issue, we are joined by Amnesty International's Regional Director in East Africa, Muthoni Wanyeki. Good morning, Muthoni. How did you get the information about the use of chemical weapons in Sudan?
Well, in our Sudan work generally, we are following the conflict situation in Blue Nile, South Kordofan, Darfur. So we were aware in January that the government of Sudan had started a military offensive against the Sudan Liberation Army, the Abdul Wahid group, and that offensive included ground attacks until May and air attacks that have continued to this day. So we were interested in looking at the impact of this offensive on the civilian population. So that's what brought us to the report.
Well, the government immediately came forward and said the report is baseless and fabricated. Muthoni, do you actually think that you're trying to steer confusion in the ongoing peace process and rather trying to jeopardize the peace process, as they said, in the country?
Well, first of all, I must say that the response we got from the Ministry of Justice this week is now up on our website. We are actually quite pleased that it responded. But in terms of challenging our methodology or saying that we're challenging the peace process, no, of course that's not true. What we're trying to portray is the situation of civilians in Jebel Marra in Darfur, and to bring African and international attention to the fact that attacks committed by the Sudan Armed Forces, the Rapid Response Forces, and the Janjaweed have indiscriminately and deliberately targeted civilians and civilian property. And we've tried to bring attention to the fact that for the first time, as far as we are aware, we have evidence demonstrating that forces have also used chemical weapons against their own population. That's what we're trying to bring attention to, and we're trying to get pressure from the region, from Africa and the rest of the world, A, that these attacks stop, B, that there be a credible investigation by the organization for the prohibition of use of chemical weapons into our evidence and into the situation more generally.
Now, Muthoni, lastly, when conflict broke out in South Sudan, the international community was very aware of it. A lot of people came up and said it should stop. But we know how much the South Sudanese government is a little bit finicky sometimes. And do you think the international community this time around is going to act based upon your recommendations?
Well, I think the evidence that we put forward demands an investigation by the AU, by the United Nations, by all states that are seeking to engage. I think what we're putting our hope on is that the government of Sudan is interested in re-engagement with the rest of the international community, and it's important for their own credibility and the credibility of the so-called dialogue going on with most of the armed and political opposition groups, that they take this report really seriously, act on it, open up to humanitarian actors to provide medical assistance, but also open up to investigators to confirm the validity of what we found so that we can act on it. These are banned weapons under international law, and Sudan it is in the interest of the government of Sudan to open up immediately.
That was Modoni Wanyeki. Thank you very much joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. Up next is the news updates from across the continent. Gabon's new Prime Minister, Emmanuel Isoze Ngondet, has held his first press conference after being appointed by President Ali Bongo. Tasked with forming a new government, Ngondet has assured to reveal his team by the weekend.
Newly appointed Gabonese Prime Minister has already begun work. Following his appointment, Emmanuel Isoze Ngondet held his first press conference to announce the date on which he is set to make public his government's new cabinet. The cabinet of the new government will be announced on Sunday, October 2nd. It is an open government, largely open to the forces of the nation, and discussions are continuing towards this course. During his press address, the head of the Gabonese government also hit out at the opposition's Jean Ping, who is yet to recognize the victory of his rival Ali Bongo.
He's the head of what party? He's the head of what party? You think the only element to be taken into account in the consideration we give to politicians is just their participation in presidential campaign?
And at the same time, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court at The Hague has announced the opening of a preliminary probe into the post-election violence that left several people dead in Gabon.
Meanwhile, Gabonese opposition leader Jean Ping insisted he does not recognize Ali Bongo Jr. as the elected president of the country. He is urging the public to unite in a day of contemplation with regard to the election results that was disputed. Have a look.
The talk of war between Ali Bongo and Jean Ping continues even after the recognition of Ali Bongo as president by the country's constitutional court. Ali Bongo is working with Gabon's newly appointed prime minister to form an open and inclusive government, but Jean Ping insists he will not recognize Ali Bongo as president. President elected by you, the people of Gabon, I reaffirm to everyone that I will not accept the government of Ali Bongo, whose hands are soiled with the blood of our compatriots. Jean Ping insists that Gabon needs to be proud of strong institutions and not a strong man.
Ali is calling for a dialogue. Can you call people to a dialogue with guns, with helicopter, with jet fighter, you know, with a gun to killing, jailing everybody? Is it what? Is it a dialogue?
Ping has called on Gabonese to reject Ali Bongo and to unite and observe a national day of contemplation on October the 6th so as to show solidarity to those who have died as well as compassion to families in mourning.
And university students in South Africa are continuing their protests against an increase in tuition fees. 11 students were arrested in Grahamstown during a face-off with the police.
Police in South Africa on Wednesday fired rubber bullets at students as protest over tuition fees increment turned into violent clashes. In Grahamstown, 11 students at Rhodes University were arrested following the protests. A local court order prohibits protests in university campuses in South Africa. Police resorted to firing rubber bullets and stun grenades to control crowds. Demonstrations across the country from Johannesburg to Cape Town have been going on for almost 2 weeks now, following a government announcement that colleges would start setting new increment rates, which are capped at 8%. Unrest has hit many South African universities over the past year as students have protested against fee increments that they say force the poorer and often black students out of education.
Now, the reign of terror by Islamist militant group Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria may not entirely be over, but the residents are finding innovative ways to make a living. Have a look at this report we compiled for you.
Nigerians displaced by the Boko Haram insurgency in the country's northeast are finding innovative ways to build businesses from scratch in order to support their families while hoping to return home someday. Over 2,000 people have been displaced and 15,000 killed in a 7-year insurgency in which the Islamist group tried to create a state adhering to Sharia Islamic law. Most of us in this camp lost our husbands in the conflict. We have many children who have daily needs and no money to take care of them. Many of those displaced had arrived at the camps without money or possessions. They have been surviving thanks to the support of the government and non-governmental organizations. The Skills Acquisition Scheme was introduced by the National Emergency Management Agency a few months ago so as to help displaced persons get training in various fields.
We don't want to make a market within the IDP settlement for some security reasons, but we always encourage if they can have an outlet somewhere, that would be very good. So that they can easily take their materials into those outlets and then sell it in wholesome and then come back to the camp.
Displaced families complain that living conditions are poor, and the United Nations says many of the makeshift shelters are overcrowded and substandard in terms of water and sanitation facilities, cooking and privacy, especially for women.